continuing with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It's the Barnes & Noble Classics edition. It has some uh, some notes and introductions and historical context put in here, as I talked about in last week's, or yeah, it was last week, in last week's episode. I'm at the preface now, and I'm not going to read the preface aloud. It was written by Percy Shelley, even though it was written as if Mary Shelley had written it. It's, I don't know. I get some subtle hints from here. Anyway, uh, it starts after the preface is done. It starts with a series of letters written from the character of a man named Robert Walton, who is an explorer, and he's setting up the story of Frankenstein proper. The first chapter, it's told from then on, from Victor Frankenstein's perspective, but the letters section that comes at the beginning are written as from Robert Walton to his sister Margaret in England. So let's get started there. I won't read aloud as much as I did last time, but I'll read a little bit here and there aloud. Something to make note of is she puts the dates in these letters. I already think of it as Robert writing the dates. The dates in Robert's letters, it tells you the month and the day, but the year is only written as 17 dash dash. So I guess is to not tie it to any particular year. It's an interesting little detail there, isn't it? Apparently, Margaret was concerned about her brother becoming an explorer. He says his first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence in the success of my undertaking. He's in Russia, I think. She's in London. He's in Russia. He wants to go all the way to the North Pole. I may there discover the wondrous power which attracts the needle, the compass point. He's romanticizing the concept of the compass always pointing north. He's a romantic, this Robert is. Very much taken with the romance of being an explorer. talks about his childhood, reading about his uncle's journeys, and about how his father didn't want him to follow his uncle on such a life. But he was so caught up in the idea of it. You can imagine there's a little bit of a parallel here with Mary herself, because as we read in the background, she kind of ran away from home herself, discarded her own father's wishes in pursuit of her own life. Though she certainly went on a different journey than the one that Robert is describing here. He talks about his early life as a sailor, 6 years of going on whaling vessels and expeditions. I am about to proceed on a long and difficult voyage, the emergencies of which will demand all my fortitude. I am required not only to raise the spirits of others, but sometimes to sustain my own when theirs are failing. A few months into his endeavor, he talks about how he's already got a ship, and he's already started collecting sailors and whatnot for his voyage. But I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy, in the absence of the object of which I now feel is a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection. I shall commit my thoughts to paper, it is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. But it is a still greater evil to me that I am self-educated. For the first 14 years of my life I ran wild on a common, and read nothing but our Uncle Thomas's books of voyages. At that age I became acquainted with the celebrated poets of our own country, but it was only when it had ceased to be in my power to derive its most important benefits from such a conviction that I perceived the necessity of becoming acquainted with more languages than that of my native country. Now I am 28, and am in reality more illiterate than many schoolboys of 15. It's perhaps another lesson that Mary learned, that when she left home, that she's trying to impart to us. You can read everything, but it can't teach you like experience can. And certainly you need to do more than just content yourself with your own culture, your own poets, your own world. You need to find other worlds, other countries, other cultures, other languages. And that's where the real learning begins. I think a lot of people miss that. We're very comfortable in our own countries. I don't know what it's like anywhere else. It's easier to explore online, but again, that's just reading. That's not living. There's a line here. A youth passed in solitude, my best years spent under your gentle and feminine fosterage, has so refined the groundwork of my character that I cannot overcome an intense distaste to the usual brutality exercised on board ship. I think maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I think there's a little bit of Mary there saying that she's not used to writing from a man's perspective. I'm probably, like I said, reading too much into that. And when I heard of a mariner equally noted for his kindliness of heart and the respect and obedience paid to him by the crew, I felt myself particularly fortunate in being able to secure his services. Gives a pretty interesting background for this character. Not not just Walton's character, but the characters of the people that he's gathering for his voyage. It's like it's almost like she's got the idea for Frankenstein, And that's one story, but she's also writing this other story of Walton and his voyages, and she's decided to tie them together, even though they're very different stories. She's developing these characters, even though so far Walton's the only one who's said anything. Some interesting background for some of these people. There is something at work in my soul which I do not understand. I am practically industrious, painstaking, a workman to execute with perseverance and labor. But besides this, there is a love for the marvelous, a belief in the marvelous, entwined in all my projects, which hurries me out of the common pathways of men, even to the wild sea and unvisited regions I am about to explore. So strange an accident has happened to us that I cannot forbear recording it, although it is very probable that you will see me before these papers can come into your possession. He's not writing letters anymore. He's on his voyage now, and he's progressed to writing in a journal. Last Monday we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving her the sea room in which she floated. Our situation was somewhat dangerous, especially as we were compassed round by a very thick fog. We accordingly lay to, hoping that some change would take place in the atmosphere and weather. About 2 o'clock the mist cleared away, and we beheld stretched out in every direction vast and irregular plains of ice which seemed to have no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention and diverted our solicitude from our own situation. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs, pass on towards the north. At the distance of 1/2 mile, a being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. This appearance excited our unqualified wonder. We were, as we believed, many hundred miles from any land, but this apparition seemed to denote that it was not in reality so distant as we had supposed. Shut in, however, by ice, it was impossible to follow his track, which we had observed with the greatest attention. Our first glimpse of the monster. I said that, he didn't say that. In the morning, as soon as it was light, I went up on deck and found all the sailors busy on one side of the vessel, apparently talking to someone in the sea. It was in fact a sledge like that we had seen before, which had drifted towards us in the night on a large fragment of ice. Only one dog remained alive, but there was a human being within it, whom the sailors were persuading to enter the vessel. He was not, as the other traveler seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered land, but a European. When I appeared on deck, the master said, "Here is our captain, and he will not allow you to perish on the open sea." On perceiving me, the stranger addressed me in English, although with a foreign accent. "Before I come on board your vessel," said he, "will you have the kindness to inform me whither you are bound?" You may conceive my astonishment on hearing such a question addressed to me from a man on the brink of destruction, and to whom I should have supposed that my vessel would have been a resource which he would not have exchanged for the most precious wealth the earth can afford. I replied, however, that we were on a voyage of discovery towards the northern pole. Upon hearing this, he appeared satisfied and consented to come on board. His limbs were nearly frozen, and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. I never saw a man in so wretched a condition. We attempted to carry him into the cabin, but as soon as he had quitted the fresh air, he fainted. We accordingly brought him back to the deck, and restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. As soon as he showed signs of life, we wrapped him in blankets and placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees, he recovered and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully. 2 days passed in this manner before he was able to speak, and I often feared that his sufferings had deprived him of understanding. When he had in some measure recovered, I removed him to my own cabin and attended on him as much as my duty would permit. I never saw a more interesting creature. His eyes have generally an expression of wildness, even madness. But there are moments when, if anyone performs an act of kindness towards him, or does him any the most trifling service, his whole countenance is lighted up, as it were, with a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equaled. but he is generally melancholy and despairing, and sometimes he gnashes his teeth, as if impatient of the weight of woes that oppress him. He goes on to talk about the stranger's recovery, and that they ask him what he was doing there. He says he was following someone. They tell him that they saw somebody on a sledge, but that they don't know what happened to that person, or even if that person might still be alive. And Robert talks about how he's starting to become friends with them. He and the stranger start to grow closer together. They start sharing. He starts sharing with him his passion for being a traveler and an explorer. And his pursuit of knowledge. He says, "As I spoke, a dark gloom spread over my listener's countenance. At first I perceived that he tried to suppress his emotion. He placed his hands before his eyes, and my voice quivered and failed me as I beheld tears trickle fast from between his fingers. At length he spoke. 'Unhappy man, do you share my madness? Have you drank also of the intoxicating draught? Hear me. Let me reveal my tale, and you will dash the cup from your lips.' Such words, you may imagine, strongly excited my curiosity, but the paroxysm of grief that had seized the stranger overcame his weakened powers, and many hours of repose and tranquil conversation were necessary to restore his composure. We are unfashioned creatures, the stranger talking, but half made up, if one wiser, better, dearer than ourselves, such a friend ought to be. Do not lend his aid to perfectionate our weak and faulty natures. I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, and am entitled therefore to judge respecting friendship. You have hope and the world before you, and have no cause for despair. But I have lost everything, and cannot begin life anew. As he said this, his countenance became expressive of a calm, settled grief that touched me to the heart. But he was silent, and presently retired to his cabin. She's doing a great job to set up the story ahead. Kind of, I guess, spoiling the ending, but definitely getting us invested in the true tale to come. Right now, we're still hearing Robert's tale, but it's increasingly becoming Frankenstein's tale. Robert, even though he's writing in his journal now, he still writes as if to his sister. He says, "Will you smile at the enthusiasm I express concerning this divine wanderer? You would not if you saw him. You have been tutored and refined by books and retirement from the world, and you are therefore somewhat fastidious. But this only renders you the more fit to appreciate the extraordinary merits of this wonderful man. Sometimes I have endeavored to discover what quality it is which he possesses that elevates him so immeasurably above any other person I ever knew. I believe it to be an intuitive discernment, a quick but never failing power of judgment, a penetration into the causes of things unequaled for clearness and precision. Add to this a facility of expression and a voice whose varied intonations are soul-subduing music." That passage starts off, I think it's more of Mary telling the readers about the difference between reading about someone or something and experiencing it for yourself. You have been tutored and refined by books, and you are therefore somewhat fastidious. You have your imagination, you have words in front of you, but you don't have a picture, even. And you certainly don't have the man himself in front of you. And that is an experience that a book cannot duplicate. I think that's what is being said here. Here we get to the last part of Robert's journal before starting the book proper. "Yesterday the stranger said to me, 'You may easily perceive, Captain Walton, that I have suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I had determined at one time that the memory of these evils should die with me. But you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my disasters will be useful to you. Yet when I reflect that you are pursuing the same course, exposing yourself to the same dangers which have rendered me what I am, I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale, one that may direct you if you succeed in your undertaking, and console you in case of failure. Prepare to hear of occurrences which are usually deemed marvelous. Were we among the tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule. But many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions, which would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature. Nor can I doubt but that my tale conveys in its series internal evidence of the truth of the events of which it is composed. You may easily imagine that I was much gratified by the offered communication, yet I could not endure that he should renew his grief by a recital of his misfortunes. I felt the greatest eagerness to hear the promised narrative, partly from curiosity and partly from a strong desire to ameliorate his fate, if it were in my power. I expressed these feelings in my answer. "I thank you," he replied, "for your sympathy, but it is useless. My fate is nearly fulfilled. I wait but for one event, and then I shall repose in peace. I understand your feeling," continued he, perceiving that I wished to interrupt him. "But you are mistaken, my friend, if thus you will allow me to name you. Nothing can alter my destiny. Listen to my history, and you will perceive how irrevocably it is determined." He told me that he would commence his narrative the next day when I should be at leisure. This promise drew from me the warmest thanks. I have resolved every night, when I am not imperatively occupied by my duties, to record as nearly as possible in his own words what he has related during the day. If I should be engaged, I will at least make notes. This manuscript will doubtless afford you the greatest pleasure. But to me, who know him, and who hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy shall I read it in some future day? Even now, as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears, his lustrous eyes dwell on me with all their melancholy sweetness. I see his thin hand raised in animation, while the lineaments of his face are irradiated by the soul within. Strange and harrowing must be his story. Frightful the storm which embraced the gallant vessel on its course, and wrecked it thus. I think that's enough for tonight. Just a few more thoughts. First of all, I said that I felt Mary Shelley was telling two stories, one with Robert Walton, and then going on with Frankenstein. But when you hear Frankenstein, who at this point is only introduced as the stranger, when you hear him tell Robert that he hopes Robert won't be destroyed by his ambitions, it's like Frankenstein's ambitions destroyed him, you realize that both he and Frankenstein are kind of the same person. Frankenstein sees himself in Robert, and he sees that his story, Frankenstein's story, has sort of begun again with Robert himself, in him investing so much in this scientific and even romantic pursuit, this exploration, this adventure on which he's embarked. Frankenstein is on some level thinking to himself, "Here we go again." and he hopes that Robert won't meet the same fate that he has met. Because we're seeing both the beginning and the end of Frankenstein's story right here. He even tells us that this is the end of his story, that he's just waiting for one more thing before his fate is ultimately sealed. So it's not so much that Mary wrote two different stories, it's that she wrote the same story in a microcosm as the introduction to the story proper. It's kind of like if you've ever read Watchmen the comics or seen the ultimate cut of it, and you've got the Tales of the Black Freighter, which is a story within a story, and it kind of parallels the events of the Watchmen comics themselves, or at least the story of one character. And I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it does give us a good setup for this story. It's not just that Robert Walton is this character who set up his own story and as a setup for Frankenstein's story, but but like I said, his story is Frankenstein's story, but at a more hopeful point in it, at a point where his own future, his own fate, is not sealed like Frankenstein believes his own to be. And perhaps even the characters that Robert introduces are types for the characters that we'll meet later on in Frankenstein's own story. Perhaps, we'll see more parallels between them as we go on. But that's all for now. It's. Do you like my Doctor Who TARDIS themed water bottle and my Doctor Who T-shirt? Futurama Doctor Who. Yeah, anyway. I don't talk a whole lot. Starting to get a scratchy throat. Anyway, as I was saying, that's about enough for tonight. I'll talk to you more later. Thank you for watching.